A story of silence. But listen closely. Connecting minds. Connecting from Africa for the world.
At first glance, it looks suspicious. Red rooftops, solar grids, perfect alignment. Satellite imagery showed a development the West didn't recognize because they hadn't approved it. One analyst flagged it as unauthorized construction. Another called it unexplained scale. Both meant the same thing. Who signed off on this? It wasn't a military base. It was 1.2 million homes. No debt, no developers, no international contracts. Just dirt, labor, and land that once sat idle. A government gave people land. People built houses. That's it. That's the model. And that's exactly why it scared the hell out of everyone watching. Too simple to be Western. Too successful to ignore. No one knew how to respond. So they did what bureaucrats always do when confronted with something real. They doubted it. Where's the budget breakdown? What's the oversight mechanism? What if this goes wrong? Never was his what says if this is exactly what's been missing. The model didn't fail the system. It skipped it. No IMF fingerprints, no private equity funds, no 5-year plans collecting dust in Geneva. Just housing, built, fast, by people who didn't need permission. And that's the part no one can digest. A functional system that doesn't ask first. Tell me this. If your country built 1.2 million homes with no debt, no PR, no permission, would it be called progress? Or a threat? Drop your answer and stay. Because this rabbit hole goes deep. This model isn't complicated. That's the problem. It's too clean, too fast, too cheap, too free from oversight, regulation, and private gain. And that makes it impossible to replicate, not technically, but politically. Because no one owns the profit. No one gets the cut. In most rich countries, housing isn't about shelter. It's a business. Homes are traded like stocks. Vacant apartments are tax tools. Neighborhoods are products. You don't live, you lease. You don't build, you borrow. Burkina Faso rewrote that. They built 1.2 million homes, no mortgages, no banks, no multi-stage policy roadmap with a logo in the corner. They didn't ask what the market thought, they asked what the people needed. And that's exactly why it won't be copied. Because here's the truth. No Western government can afford to make housing this simple. Not because they lack materials, but because they've built everything, systems, laws, politics, around complexity. Complexity feeds control. Control feeds capital. This model strips that down to nothing. Land, labor, sunlight, and the will to stop waiting. That's it. That's the entire formula. Try selling that in Washington. Try pitching that to BlackRock. There's no margin in self-sufficiency, no dividend in dignity. And that's why they won't touch it. Not because it doesn't work, but because it works too well for people who were never supposed to win. So what do you think? If the system won't copy what works, is it still a system? Or is it just a business? They got tired of filling out forms that went nowhere, tired of waiting on ministries that never visited, of standing in lines just to hear, come back next week. So one day, they stopped. They didn't riot. They didn't beg. They picked up bricks and started building like no one was coming. You know who showed up first? The ones with nothing. Not the NGOs, not the experts. It was mothers with kids on their hips, grandfathers with bad knees, teenagers with zero training and full hearts, people who'd never owned anything, but somehow knew exactly what a home should feel like. No one gave orders. They just looked at the land and said, this is ours now. And they started digging. Some brought buckets. Some brought songs. Some brought nothing but time. Did it matter? No. Because finally, they weren't waiting. They were moving. There's a woman named Aminata. She's not a headline. She's not a case study. She's someone's mom. She once sold peanuts by the roadside. Now, she has a house. She helped build it. Not symbolically, actually. She mixed clay. She cut bamboo. She hauled 200 bricks while her baby slept under a tree. When the house was done, she didn't take selfies. She took a nap. First safe one in 42 years. Tell me, what policy paper gives you that? If you've ever had to do it on your own, comment, did it anyway. If you've ever been ignored until the job was done, share this, because that's what they did. They stopped asking. They stopped hoping someone would write in with answers. They became the answer. And now there's a whole skyline built by people nobody believed in. They weren't supposed to touch that land. It was already owned by a man who lives in Paris, hasn't visited in years, and still earns rent from nothing. The land was empty. But people weren't. So they started building. No deed, no permit, just bricks. They broke the rules, and that's why it worked. No zoning approval, no master plan, no waiting for some ministry to stamp a document written by someone who's never seen the place. They just looked at the land, looked at each other, and said, "Do we really need permission to live?" Apparently not. It wasn't chaos, it wasn't theft, it was repair. Fixing what centuries of ownership without presence had destroyed, fixing what bureaucracy forgot, fixing what maps marked wrong on purpose. Let's be real. If they had followed the rules, they'd still be waiting, still renting dirt, still losing children to rain and mold. So they broke the rules. Not to destroy, to survive. And somehow everything got cleaner, safer, kinder. Funny how that works. They made their own rules. If your neighbor's house isn't finished, you're not done either. If you eat today, the guy building your wall eats too. If you've got a key, you damn well better earn it. Nothing written, nothing enforced, just practiced. Better than most governments manage. And the best part? They didn't call it revolution. They just called it necessary. Be honest, if your child had no roof tonight, would you wait for a permit? Or would you do what they did, shitted? Drop it in the comments, no permit, just purpose. No one said it out loud, but the fear was clear. Not fear of failure, that's easy to ignore. This was worse. Fear of success. Without permission. Burkina Faso didn't ask the IMF, didn't host investor roundtables, didn't wait for some G20 committee to greenlight a housing plan with a name like Future Shelter Vision 2045. They just built. And it worked, which means one thing: they proved we've all been lied to. For decades, the global playbook said, first, get foreign capital, then hire foreign firms, let them design, let them own. Pray the benefits. Trickle down. Burkina Faso skipped that part and built homes for people who'll never leave them empty. That's not just a model, that's a threat to everything the current system is built on. Because if poor people can solve their problems without outside help, what's the point of all these conferences? Why do billions keep flowing through agencies that never touch a brick? More importantly, who's left holding power when people stop asking? That's why this story wasn't front page. That's why no G7 leader posted a congratulatory tweet. That's why Western media still calls it controversial. You know what's really controversial? Ending homelessness without debt. The fear isn't clay houses, it's the questions they raise. Why didn't we do this? What were we waiting for? Who's been profiting from the delay? Real talk. If this happened in Sweden, it'd be called innovation. But because it happened in Burkina Faso, it's called unorthodox. You feel that? Good. Comment. Now I see it. Because this isn't about charity, it's about control, and someone just lost it. They didn't say it out loud, they didn't have to. They just stopped showing up to aid meetings, stopped waiting for donor funds to clear, stopped asking permission to do what they already knew how to do. That silence? That's the part that scares power the most, because when people stop asking, they stop obeying. You can give aid forever, as long as people stay grateful. But once they figure out you're not essential, once they learn to build without your frameworks, you're no longer the helper. You're the middleman. And in Burkina Faso, they cut the middleman out. Here's what happened. The government reclaimed thousands of hectares of unused land, no compensation to absentee landlords. Over 45,000 villagers were involved in manual construction. Labor was paid in tools, food, and land titles. No contractors, no inflated bids. Solar panels were installed in nearly 70% of new units, bypassing fossil fuel dependency entirely. Water access tripled in target districts within 18 months, not because of World Bank funding, but because local crews dug and repaired wells without asking anyone. None of this came from abroad, not a single Western blueprint, not one foreign CEO in a hard hat for the camera, just people who got tired of being told what's possible. You know what they built besides houses? Schools, with no fees, clinics, staffed by locals trained on site, community farms, on what used to be private hunting reserves. That's what happens when the poor stop being beneficiaries and start acting like owners. And here's the kicker. They didn't riot. They didn't elect a populist messiah. They just organized. Quietly. Fast. Together. The world wasn't watching Miss Sins because it didn't expect them to matter. Now they're a model no one wants to admit works. Be honest with yourself. If people stop needing aid, who loses their job? Who stops getting invited to summits? Who stops being the savior? Drop a comment. We were never the problem. Because maybe the real dependency was never ours. Let's cut the noise. Burkina Faso, the country ranked 184th on the Human Development Index, just housed over 1 million people in less than 2 years, no bailouts, no billion-dollar loans, no media campaign. Meanwhile, the US has over 650,000 homeless. The UK added just 32,000 social homes last year, a 74% drop from 2010. Paris has empty luxury apartments worth $3.5 billion, while nurses commute 2 hours because they can't afford rent. So who's failing who? For decades, the West wrote the definitions. They told us developed means skyscrapers, 4-lane highways, tech hubs, GDP curves. They called it progress. Even if no one could afford the homes, even if the streets are full of tents, even if people die with insulin in their hands because the price tripled last year. You want graphs? Fine. Here's one. In the richest country on earth, 60% of people live paycheck to paycheck. That's not development. That's survival with branding. Burkina Faso didn't beat anyone. They just stopped copying a broken formula. And that alone exposed the truth. Maybe it's not that they are underdeveloped. Maybe we are over-engineered and underhuman. Look around. A city where homes are free, light is solar, food is local, and water is owned by the people, versus a city where rent eats half your income, power goes to shareholders, and tap water comes with a side of lead. Which one feels more developed to you? Here's the part no one wants to admit. Burkina Faso didn't do the impossible. They just did the obvious. And that's what hurts. Because if they can build without debt, without consultants, without saving face on global stages, then what's our excuse? If you're from a developed country and this makes you uncomfortable, it should. Comment. We've got work to do. Not because we're behind them, but because we finally see that maybe we've never really been ahead. Remember how this started? An aerial photo, rows of rooftops, neat and red, symmetrical, solar-lined, too organized to be poor, too clean to be trusted. Analysts flagged it, called it a possible military installation, zoomed in, expecting war. What they saw? Children playing soccer. A grandmother planting mint, a brick still warm from a worker's hand. That's the image we couldn't explain, because it didn't fit our narrative. Poor countries aren't supposed to self-organize, villages aren't supposed to scale, people who used to wait for rice bags aren't supposed to build entire cities. But they did. And they're not asking what we think about it. The satellite caught a skyline, but it missed the bigger picture. It missed the shift. A community no longer asking, a government no longer performing, a people no longer waiting. They didn't win a war. They just stopped losing. One woman said, "This is the first time I feel like I live in the present, not in someone else's future." And somehow, that line says more than any headline. If this story made you feel something, don't just scroll, drop a comment, send it. Ask someone, what would it look like if we built like this? Because that future, it's already here, just not where the world was looking.